I'm hoping all the technology works properly. Okay, great. Great. Thank you very much for coming. When I talk about the book, which I'm always very happy to do, I always ask the audience, just the question you ask is, how many of you came from the Bronx? How many of you came from the West Bronx? How many of you lived on or near the Concourse? And I'm always impressed that there's a show of hands. I also have to say that I'm very thrilled to be speaking at this museum, especially with the show up, because there really is such an overlap between the world of Grand Concourse and the world of the Garment District, and in particular, I mean, not only in many ways kind of a similar mindset and similar period, but in fact, so many of the people who lived on or near the Concourse had the wherewithal to do so because they were owners or part owners or highish enough up powers in the Garment District. They weren't the people necessarily who were cutting the fabric, but they owned a piece of the Garment District, and it was the money from that sort of life that enabled them to have a very lovely residential life on the Grand Concourse. This is a picture of the boulevard for those of you who are not familiar with it. I have to say that it's interesting from almost a design point of view that for a street that is so fabled and so important and was so beautiful for many decades, it was almost impossible to get a good picture of it for the cover of the book. And in fact, the reason that they added the blue sky, I think, was to make it look prettier. And I think that it's a very optimistic little design concept that there's a blue sky over the Grand Concourse. I also, when you mentioned the subtitle of the book, the story I always wanted to write was using the Grand Concourse to tell the story of the rise and fall and rebirth of an urban neighborhood. It seemed like the perfect kind of image within a bell jar to discuss this subject, which has been so written about so often and so eloquently in the last half of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st century. And what intrigued me about the Grand Concourse was not only that it served as a perfect way to explore the rise and fall and in some ways rebirth of a neighborhood. I think it's possible to overstate the rebirth part. But that for so many people, all they really knew about the Bronx was the Bronx's burning Bronx and the South Bronx and the arson and bonfire of the vanities. And what initially intrigued me about the story, and I'm not from New York, so I'm not one of these people who's writing about the Bronx because I came from there. I came from upstate New York, and I came to New York after college, and I've lived here. It's a long time ago, but I've lived here ever since, very, very happily. And I had discovered the Bronx when I was doing reporting for the New York Daily News, where I worked in the late 70s and the early 80s. And at the time, I did an article for the Daily News Sunday magazine about what were called Street of Dreams, really not so different from Boulevard of Dreams. And I was so impressed to discover what a rich, culturally, sociologically history the Boulevard had. And I think that it's a history that many people don't know about. All they know is the tragedy of the Bronx and the sorrow and the drugs and the crime and the social disarray. And it seemed to me very important to tell the story and to remind people that even an area in great social disarray, it had a very lustrous past and could have a lustrous in a different way sort of future. And the other story that was very, very important to me, and I hope the book conveys, and something I kind of learned as I worked on it, has to do with the importance of place to people. And I think that if you live in a nice building or a nice apartment in a nice neighborhood, as I do, I live in Brooklyn Heights with this amazing view, sort of the opposite of the museum view, I guess. And I've always, I think, been very lucky in where I live, but I know that that's not true for many people. And I thought that it was very important to be able to talk about the importance of the place where you live as a shaper of your feelings and your attitudes towards life. And one of the things I was very struck by in the book, that as rapturously as some of the old-time residents, 20s, 30s, 40s residents of the Grand Concourse spoke about the street and the neighborhood and the buildings, that many of the newcomers, even though they were very different socioeconomic level, spoke about the street with the same awe and the same delight. And they spoke about the size of the apartments, and they spoke about the views and the trees, although sadly there are not as many trees as there were back in the day. But it made you realize that a place had tremendous importance on a person's attitude, and it wasn't over when the population changed. It could have that same effect on a new population. Next, I'll skip a couple of images. So I'll skip this, and then the next one. Okay. The concourse celebrated its centennial in 2009, which means that it opened in 1909 and was 20 years in the making. So in that respect, it rivals some of the very familiar and nearby construction projects of today. And as with them, it was rent by political discord and charges of fraud and money disappearing in large quantities, and political polls that when you read about them, even in their late 19th century guise, seem distressingly familiar today. And the person who was the creator of the Grand Concourse, who is a very sadly little known person today, but whose story I was very moved by. I was moved by many of the stories of many of the people who were involved in the making of this world, but his very, very much so. His name was Louis Rees. He was a French engineer, born around 1850. He came to the Bronx when he was a teenager and the start of what was going to be a round the world trip. And he was so enamored of the Bronx, even though it was a mostly farmland, woodland, undeveloped area back then, that he stayed for his entire life. And he started his life as an urban surveyor, laying out the streets of the Bronx. Sadly, they didn't have the grid plan that we have in Manhattan, but they did need streets. And I was charmed by the fact that when they would go out on their surveying tasks, they would wear these straw hats and their suits, and I guess didn't get dirty, but they did make these trips. Yeah, next. You can see him here in his office in what was the Bronx County building, since destroyed, replaced by new buildings. And this is Rees holding one of the early maps and drawings of the Grand Concourse. All the descriptions of him were as a very lovely and sort of not power-hungry person, which was interesting in the late 19th century Bronx, which as I discovered was well, like any place, but was deeply roiled by political turmoil and intrigues and power struggles. And although he was the commissioner of public works, or whatever the equivalent title 100 years ago was, he somehow managed to stand a bit apart from the fray. Yes, next. You can see the original drawings and images of the boulevard, which is 4.5 miles long and was 11 lanes wide, and was designed with underpasses, some of which still exist today, for example, Fordham Road, 161st Street. And the intent at the time was to have commercial traffic, which would be commercial horses and buggies, pre-auto, be able to go underneath, like the underpasses in Central Park. But this is believed to be the first occasion where that engineering concept was used for a thoroughfare. You can see the trees planned along the route. Next. And the original plan, this is in the late 19th century, was to have the boulevard lined with villas, single-family homes in sort of the Italianate style, I guess. And you can see from this drawing a sense of what the street would have looked like. So obviously Rees envisioned something that was very different from what would become, because eventually the house would be lined, the street would be lined by the the 6-story Art Deco apartment buildings that are such a familiar part of the landscape. But I think this image, and also the little man on the horse, I mean, it looks like a dollhouse version, was you know, a very kind of almost European sense of what would transpire here. Yes. Again, another image of this broad 11-lane thoroughfare with, remember this is post-auto, when they were pre-auto, when they were designing it. And the 11 lanes were all had separate uses. They had horseback riders. It was originally seen as a route that would help riders be able to have a place to ride their horses. And then there would be horses and carriages, and there would be promenaders separated, going uptown, going downtown. And you can see how lushly it's planted when you go up to the concourse today. I feel like every time I go, there are more trees that have disappeared, even though there's been tree planting going on since its centennial. But you have a sense of what a green and lush and sort of Parisian look it would have had. It's always, people from the Bronx always say it was the Champs-Élysées of the Bronx. Interestingly, Riis himself never used that phrase, but he had spent some time in Paris. He was French. He was in Paris pre his what was going to be the round-the-world trip. And it would, of course, not been surprising that he was familiar with what the Champs-Élysées looked like. Yeah. These are, this is Riis in front of the, a drawing of one of several that remain of the Grand Concourse. These maps still exist, and they're in the map department of the borough president's office. And I saw them. They let you make photocopies. They're huge, like the size of this room, but they're thrilling to look at because they're very huge. They're very detailed. You see the Grand Concourse slicing through a good part of the Bronx, which at the time you have to remember was just, you know, woodland and forest. And in fact, the way that Riis had learned about the area specifically is he used to go game hunting with his little engineer friends, and they would, you know, shoot, you know, squirrels or quail or grouse, or maybe they didn't have grouse. But he came to learn about the area, and especially the ridge atop which the Grand Concourse is built, one of 3 ridges that slice through the Bronx north-south. And any of you who have gone up and down the step stairs that are common in this part of the Bronx are aware of how hilly it is, and that also explains where there's not as much east-west transportation as people would like in that area. Next. This is an image of what it was like when they were building the Grand Concourse, a construction project that went from 1902 to 1909. And when I've shown this image to people who live near the construction of the 2nd Avenue subway, they all kind of groan. They say, "This is what it's like. It's horrible. I hate it." And of course, this was in an age when I'm sure they had less, you know, pollution and noise controls than they have now. Although I don't think they have a lot for the 2nd Avenue subway. But you can see that the people who lived in the little houses, because there were some houses along the route, which was a sort of informal route, not the boulevard it would become, that they literally walked out of their doorstep, and if they weren't careful, they were in the construction pit. They had to, there are some wonderful descriptions of what their life was like at the Bronx County Historical Society. They had to build little, like, separate wooden steps to get themselves back into the world of the Bronx. And this went on for 7 years. You can imagine what a horrible life it was. But interestingly, I mean, one of the things that was fascinating about the book is what kind of documentation is out there about this street. And for some reason that I still don't understand, there are hundreds and hundreds of photographs just like this showing what the construction was like. And I can't imagine who did it and who cared, but you know, happily for anyone doing research, these documents survive the pictures, and they give you a very vivid sense of what a disruption this must have been. It's built. It opens on a rainy, stormy November day in November of 1909, and nothing happens. for at least a decade. There's this gorgeous road going through the Bronx, north to south, and very little is built along it. There may be permits for, a few buildings or maybe a few dozen buildings per year, not very much. And no one much uses it. And there's World War I, which slows down, construction and interest in development. But suddenly, by the 20s, the Grand Concourse takes off, yes. And suddenly, buildings start to emerge along its flanks. And the developers of all of them are interesting, but one of the most interesting is Logan Billingsley, who was a power in the Bronx and head of the Bronx Chamber of Commerce, and the brother of Sherman Billingsley, who some of you may remember from the Stork Club. He was a bootlegger. His son is still alive, and he was in trouble all the time as a bootlegger, and in and out of jail. He'd be jailed and he'd escape and be found and be back again, and hopscotched all over the country being in trouble. And finally, by this point, I think Sherman was in New York, and Logan decided to come to New York and to be a builder and a power in Bronx politics, and go straight and also make a lot of money. And I asked his son why he thinks he made this sudden about face, and he said, I think he just wanted to stay out of jail. But he did manage to do that. Next picture, please. And his great achievement on the Bronx, which was one of a slew of large apartment houses that arrived in the early 20s, was what was known as the Theodore Roosevelt, which was this block-long or block-size apartment house with a great courtyard, landscape courtyard inside, with a marble statue of Theodore Roosevelt with a lion. And it was a very, very elegant place to live in the Bronx. And it was among the buildings that arrived in the 20s, and they would arrive in the 30s, that became a mecca for the upwardly mobile Jews who flocked to the concourse and whose presence in this part of the West Bronx was so defining for the street, for the area, for the borough, for the city. They were not the immigrants. The immigrants start out on the Lower East Side, and they hopscotch their way up to, some up to Harlem, and then up to the East Bronx, and then others to Brooklyn, of course. The ones who went to the East Bronx slowly made their way to the West Bronx, not directly to the concourse very often, but to the side streets with the lower, often walk-up buildings. But those who were, lucky, wealthy, ambitious, and lucky were able to make their way to the Grand Concourse. And it was a defining arrival for them. When you see ads for buildings in the 20s and the 30s, they'll be defined by their proximity to the Grand Concourse, on the Grand Concourse, right off the Grand Concourse, just a few blocks from the Grand Concourse. And among the wonderful things I discovered in the research for the book, there's a great novel called Grand Concourse that came out in the early 50s. And it's sort of a terrible novel, but it's wonderful if you are interested in urban history in this part of the world. And it's about people who live on, off, near, far, very far from the concourse, and their intertwined lives and their love lives and economic lives. But what's fascinating about the novel, other than how terrible it is that that everyone's position in society is defined by where they lived vis-a-vis the boulevard. It was such a defining aspect of Bronx life, and it was so important for this population. Yes, next. The Roosevelt Gardens was one of the important buildings built in the Grand Concourse in the 20s. Another was Lewis Morris further north. At that point, the tallest apartment house on the boulevard, not sadly a skyscraper, but nonetheless very tall and famous not only for its silk-loved doorman, but as the place where so many of the Bronx's doctors lived. And many, many people who grew up in the West Bronx, whose parents grew up in the West Bronx, what they remember is going to a doctor or a dentist who had an office at Lewis Morris. And its location was so well known. One of its then early residents said to me that when you, if you took a cab and were going to the Lewis Morris, you'd just say, "Take me to the Lewis Morris." You wouldn't have to say an address because everybody knew where it was. Had a number of famous residents, one of whom was David Halberstam. And everyone I talked to about Lewis Morris said, "Oh, it was so impressive, and you're so honored to live there, and you felt like a very special person." And I asked David Halberstam, who's no marshmallow, if he felt that way, and he was very dismissive of my theory. And he said, no, there was nothing special about the building, there was nothing special about the people, and went on to tell me how there was nothing special about it. But afterwards, other residents of Lewis Morris said, "Well, that's David Halberstam for you. He wouldn't think anything is special." But it was still thrilling to talk to him. His father was a doctor, had an office there, like so many. But the buildings that we know, we care most about, really, along the Grand Concourse, even though there aren't as many as we think. We sort of realize that as some of them got historic designated recently, is the Art Deco buildings that were built in the late 20s, through the 30s, and even into the 40s, and oddly sprouted up with considerable energy even during the recession, even during the Depression, when you would have thought there would have been a considerable construction stoppage in the Bronx, but for reasons I never totally figured out, the Bronx was not battered quite as much by the Depression in terms of construction. The buildings, when I first looked at them, when I first went up to look at them, I thought, I say this in the book, I thought I had come to the wrong place, because I thought there would be very, very spiffy structures. And I did see this. I saw the mostly 6-story white brick, by now very faded white brick, apartment houses with sort of ruffly facades, setbacks and so on. And I was waiting to see lots of mosaics and terrazzo floors and flecks of gold and enamel. And I think that part of why they don't make the impression now that they would have made in their day is because they've, even though they've survived structurally, they've fallen on hard times, but also our aesthetic changes, and it's sometimes hard to remember what people liked several generations ago. But the more I learned about them, and the more I really looked at them, and the more I read about them, the more I came to love them. And one of the things that I found very moving is that, really with very few exceptions, the Art Deco architects of the Bronx were not famous like so many of the architects of Manhattan. And it was explained to me that part of it is that they were working in the Bronx, which wasn't as prestigious a place as Manhattan. But I felt very badly that they hadn't been given the attention that I thought they deserved, because many of them were very, very prolific. They did dozens and dozens of buildings. They did amazing things with interiors that we kind of forget because we're used to more graceful interiors, but you remember that a lot of what they had as inspiration was railroad flats. And the level of decor and charm that these buildings had is wonderful. And people loved them. People were proud to live in them. They were proud to come into the lobbies. They were proud to come into their buildings. There were mosaics in lobbies, as you can see. Picture this in color. Next. The interiors were wonderful. The famous sunken living room, who in this audience knows what a sunken living room is, everybody. 2 steps down with a little wrought iron railing that seems like a small detail, but gave the living room a sense of specialness. The wraparound windows on the corners that gave you, in every apartment, you got sun, you got light and air. Remember, this was an era before air conditioning. You see the dining rooms, you see the maids' rooms. These were not atypical. It was middle-class housing, middle to upper middle class, but nonetheless, they were spacious. They were beautifully laid out. I think you don't realize how well laid out unless you're in railroad flats. And the walls are sturdy. The buildings still stand today, most of them, and people prize all these things about them. But every architect I spoke to said, you couldn't build this stuff today. You couldn't afford to build something so sturdy. Next. I see that this is one of the higher ones, but you can see the facades with the little sort of frilly or setback type things. So they were interesting to look at visually, even though they were just mostly the white brick. Next. More. Again, the kind of rhythmic variety. Next. If you can picture this in color, this is, I think, the lobby of the building at 8088 Grand Concourse, the one Emory Roth building on the boulevard opposite the courthouse, south of the Concourse Plaza Hotel. And this is all blues and silvers and lovely luscious curves. They're great use of mosaic, of terrazzo floors, of recessed lighting, murals, as I mentioned. Lots of glitter and lots of splash. Yeah. Again, another lobby. They all had lovely lobbies, not necessarily large, but very, very, very decorative. Many of the floors survive today under threadbare carpet, but you can see the mosaics peeking out. Beautiful lustrous woods, yes. Yeah, another example. These are blues and silvers. This is the Emory Roth building again. Another facade showing the wraparound windows. Yeah. And this is a building by Horace Ginsburg, who was one of the, I think, possibly the most prolific Art Deco architect to work in the Bronx. I talked to people who, well, he's sadly gone, but I talked to people who knew him, family and some friends. I suspect he wasn't the nicest person in the world. He had a very, his grandson said he looked like Hitler and sometimes acted like Hitler. But he had a very charming partner who I think was, the one who didn't antagonize the clients. But he was a brilliant architect in terms of both interiors and exteriors. And this is a facade of one of his earliest, perhaps the earliest Art Deco buildings on Jerome Avenue. And the image you see is of the architect showing a model of his Art Deco building to the Parthenon, was the arbiter of all that is good in architect. And this is a polychrome design, if you picture it in color, and golds and reds and greens. And the next image, again, the facade, and you could see the sun rising from behind a typical Bronx Art Deco apartment house. And again, a sense of optimism and delight and pride that really ran through so much of the architecture along the Grand Concourse. Yeah. Also, if those of you who are familiar with the Art Deco in Miami, which is the other great trove of Art Deco, there were a lot of nautical themes here too, as there were there, of course, with the sort of porthole type windows. And next, another facade, another lobby. Again, picture all the colors, gold and green and orange, I think. And this most famous image from outside of a Bronx building. Who recognizes this? Yeah. Fish building. It's a couple of blocks up. Yeah, right. And it's the Fish building, and this is a mosaic. You see, it's a fish that was on the facade of the building, another Ginsburg building, and actually changed its name from Ginsburg to Ginsburg, and so on some of the early drawings you see Ginsburg. But there were colored mosaics of underwater marine life on the front of the building. They're still there. They're not so large. It almost looks bigger here than on the front of the building. But this was probably along with Lewis Morris, the single most famous apartment house on the Grand Concourse, and it was always called the Fish Building. It, never had another name, or if it did, nobody knew about it. But it was a very one of the charming, lovely, unusual, slightly nutty architectural details that you could find, but it's there today. The mosaics have sort of lasted. Kids come and look at it, and it continues to be very appealing to people. Next. This is what the boulevard looked like not too long after its construction. You can see that trees are being planted. You can see that apartment houses are rising along its flanks. And it's almost impossible to overstate how important this street was during mid-century Bronx. It was the fact that you could go its entire length without being interrupted by crosstown traffic was very significant. Think of what it's like with parades along Fifth Avenue when crosstown traffic has to move. It was a very popular parade route. And you also have to remember the parades were a more important thing than very patriotic years that we're talking about. And for holidays like Memorial Day, which was known as Decoration Day, as everyone over about 70 who lived on the Bronx reminded me, and I remember that a little bit too. But there were wars that soldiers were either going off to or coming home from or had been wounded in, and victories and many occasions. There were also very, very local civic booster occasions. There was Bronx Day, which was a big day in the Bronx, and there were girls on floats, like Miss Melrose and Miss Morrisania and Miss Throg's Neck, who would vie for the title of Miss Bronx. So that was very exciting. It was also a very, very important route for politicians. I talked to Herman Badillo, and he said he used to go up and down the Grand Concourse handing out Brillo pads. Brillo for Badillo. And it was like a day when handing out soap pads would help your political fortunes. And I'm blanking on what Robert Abrams did, but he also did it. And they used to jog up and down and bike up and down, although I don't think Abrams biked. But it was, shaking hands, people in the parks along the boulevard, Poe Park, Franz Siegel Park, Joyce Kilmer Park, were places where people hung out, where crowds could be found, and it was like retail politics, where your motorcade going along and shaking hands and handing out flyers and buttons was an important part of the political process. Next picture. Here you can see, there's even a later image because you can see the trees are not with us so much. But this was the famed Concourse Plaza Hotel at 161st Street and the Boulevard. Over here is Yankee Stadium. Over here is the courtyard. Here's the Emory Roth building. The hotel, which was built in 1923, opened in 1923, the same year as the stadium, was the most luxurious hotel in the Bronx, which was not, to be honest, saying a great deal. But it was nonetheless a very sumptuous and opulent place with famous ballrooms and crystal chandeliers and flocked wallpaper. And it was where all the best weddings and bar mitzvahs were held. It was the heart of the Brooklyn Democratic Organization, which was all they had politically in the Bronx was Democrats. And the lawyers and the judges hung out there, the political operatives, unsurprisingly, because the courthouse was just across the way. And it was, and where the civic groups would meet, and the apartments, which were really originally residential apartments where people would just live with, by the way, a lot of help and in-house restaurants, were very luxurious. And the hotel was touted as the location as 15 minutes to Times Square, 30 minutes to Wall Street. And of course, one of the strengths of the Bronx continuing today, and one of the reasons those who think it'll make a comeback think that will happen, is because whatever it suffered, transportation was always wonderful and quick. And even when I would shuttle there back and forth from Brooklyn Heights, I was always amazed at how quickly I was there. Next picture. Here again, one of the images of the many parades that used this as a route. Next. This is one of my favorite pictures in the book. This is now a grown-up named Sam Goodman, who works as a planner in the Bronx Borough President's office. He grew up in the Bronx on the Grand Concourse. He was born there. He was like third generation. He left, he came back. He now works on behalf of the borough. But this is him as a child in front of the famed Lorelei fountain, marble fountain of Lorelei, the queen of the Rhine maiden, in Joyce Kilmer Park in the 50s when he was a small child. And the statue, which is now over 100 years old and had come to us from Europe, and after hopping around a little bit in New York, in Manhattan, ended up in the Bronx, was one of the very famous landmarks of the West Bronx. As you will see in a later image, it fell on hard times. But what I think is wonderful about this image, aside from the little coats that I guess that boys wore and sort of snowsuits, is it's a very optimistic picture. You see a smiling child and a very luxurious piece of public sculpture in the background. And it was very much, even though it was the 50s, when there were subtle changes happening in the Bronx that would eventually undermine it very badly, that they're not visible in this image, and it really captures a hopeful moment. Yeah, next. This is Yankee Stadium on its early moments, 1923, and you can see the period by the cars. Just down the street from the concourse, from the hotel. And not personally, I'm ashamed to admit, being a major baseball person, I didn't understand until people told me how important it was having a major, not only a Major League Baseball stadium in your backyard, but the Yankees, which for decades and decades and decades were, not the only, but the main team to be conjured with. And and won and won and won, hence damn Yankees, that's why you have that title. But everyone I talked to who remembers, not quite back to 1923, but the glory years of the team, talked about how wonderful it was having these ball players in their backyard. And they would come up the hill to go to the, year after year victory dinners at the hotel, and many of them stayed at the hotel, as did visiting team members. And people said it was as if gods were striding the street. And one woman, I don't know if it may have been Laura Cunningham, who writes such lovely memoirs about growing up in the Bronx, West Bronx. She said, I don't know if they washed the streets or put down a red carpet, but it felt as if they did. And people would, little boys, of course, but almost everyone almost wanted to touch these people who seemed larger than life. And you also remember that whatever scandals there were in baseball, people didn't know as much, and maybe there were fewer. It was pre-knowing about the salaries or steroids or whatever. The game, I think, seemed pure and more innocent, and I think that enhanced the feeling that these gods were striding among us if you lived in the Bronx. Next, the victory dinners, year after year after year. Next, and this is its lovely restaurant, and the building still stands. Somewhat worse for wear, but you can still see the classical detailing on the facade. Next. And as I said, it was the place for the important bar mitzvahs and weddings in the Bronx. The movie and play The Catered Affair about the mother who dreams that her daughter will be married in the Grand Concourse is an example of its tug on the public imagination. This is a young Greek couple. She was a teenager and he wasn't too much older. And her father had a florist shop on Kingsbridge Road. And so, of course, the flowers were very lovely at her wedding. But she was married at the Grand Concourse in one of the ballrooms. When I went to visit the hotel in the early 80s, when it was still sort of open to visitors and there were a lot of government offices there, city offices, you could still see in the ballrooms the signs saying, check your fur coats here, and you could still see some of the gilding and the gold railings. There was few little very tragic traces of what these rooms were like in their day, but it really was the height of Bronx living to have an event at the hotel. Next. I don't know how many of you here are familiar with the Andrew Friedman home, which is getting repurposed for hopefully new life. But it's one of the great institutions and mysterious institutions along the concourse that also arrived in the 20s, the same period as the hotel and the stadium. The man behind it, Andrew Friedman, who was a great power in turn of the century New York in terms of baseball, in terms of development of the subway. I think there's been some revisionist history about him recently, but by many accounts he was a horrid individual and was loathed even in a day when many people loathed owners of baseball teams, and anti-Semitic and many other things. But he did leave as a legacy a truly amazing building, the next picture, which was the Andrew Friedman home, which is at 166, I think. A block long on a little hill structure, Italian Renaissance style. I saw the original in Rome, and it looks like this sort of pale yellow marble. It was built as an institution to house the formerly rich who had become poor, because Friedman, who himself had been rich and lived through various panics, as depressions were known, or small depressions, believed that it was worse to have been rich and become poor than to always be poor, because the always poor had, what did they know? And so he felt that the formerly rich who'd become poor needed his attention. So he never married, never had any children. He left his entire fortune, which is quite considerable, not only to constructing this building, but to endowing it in such a way that that the 100 or 200 people who lived there, who had been vetted to make sure they had been rich, were kept in great comfort. Many servants, luxurious meals, a wonderful library, gorgeous architecture inside, beautiful rooms, each of which had a different color palette so that they could visit each other's rooms and not be bored. And what's wonderful about this building, though, because it, like so much along Concourse, fell upon very hard times, and its clientele grew poorer and poorer and poorer, and then disappeared. It was empty. It was used for Head Start programs, stuff like that. But there's efforts afoot to repurpose it as something. I think hasn't been quite decided what, but there was recently, and I saw it, it was great, an exhibition there of contemporary art related to the building's past. I think it was called Empty No More. It may have had a little better name. But it had some relics from the old face of the Friedman home, including the text of a wonderful article that Vivian Gornick wrote when it was on the way down, talking to the residents who were very sad not to be part of the earlier generation, and mesmerizing photographs by Sylvia Plackey that had been, some of which had been published in The Voice, where Vivian wrote the article, for which Vivian wrote the article. But it was a real memory of that stage in the building's life. But even from the outside, it's a very, very imposing structure. At the time, residents were in the garden. Residents were allowed to plant their favorite flowers and trees, so they would have like little attachment to the site. Next. If the Friedman home is one of the memorable buildings along the concourse, the other was the one designed by another European immigrant. His name was John Eberson, and he was the person who designed Loewy's Paradise. The next picture. As you can see, even in later days, when the clock with St. George and the Dragon striking the hour has been stolen, like so many things on Bronx facades. If there's one image, one place that anyone in the West Bronx and many other parts of the world remember, it was this palatial movie theater that opened right around the crash, 1929, the fall, and was seated several thousand people, and was built, next picture, to resemble Italian Baroque garden with sculpture and statuary and niches and real canaries and marble fountains with real goldfish that sadly died eventually. And most notable, of course, this movie palace was the auditorium with a domed ceiling known as atmospheric, on which clouds drifted and little stars twinkled, and then the show would start. And I think there's no one in the Bronx who had their sight who did not see 1 or 1,000 movies in this setting. And what and Emerson, who was a very interesting character and who designed many atmospherics all around the country, all in with different international themes. This was Italian. But what I found fascinating about the auditorium is there were articles about the technology that were used. There were machines you could buy that gave you the stars and gave you the clouds. But I suspect that no one who ever saw these effects ever thought about what happened. And in fact, some people said, I thought they were real, I thought it would rain, I didn't know. And what is very fortunate is that although its fortunes, again, like so much, declined over decades, it was recently, within the last decade or so, restored to its early glory. And it's now not open to the public. It's used for sports events, some music, boxing, I think. But I was in it as they were putting on the finishing touches. And it was gorgeous. It looked just like the early pictures. And among the people who were wandering around were people who had actually been to movies there in its day. And they just were in a trance because it was so like it had been. I have to say that the people who consider themselves real cineasts in the Bronx they went to Loewy's, but they also went to the Ascot, which was a little further down and was one of the first art houses, as they were called, in the city. And I swear, everyone I talked to, like Avery Corman and Arthur Gelb, remembered every single movie they had seen at the Ascot, which was apparently famous also for being one of the first places that served espresso, which at the time was a very daring thing to do, to have a little cup of bitter black coffee. Next picture. The person who was the head usher in the mid-50s, whose name is Gerald Mcqueen, this is him with his fleet. He grew up to be a much decorated New York police officer, and then he went on, and thanks for his help, to be given the post of running the Javits Center. So he's an example of how one can rise from lowly levels. Next. When I was writing the book, I didn't want to just write about the white, ethnic, sentimental, egg cream, stickball, wasn't it wonderful Bronx, because as rich as that story is, and as much as that's the true story for many people who lived in the Bronx, lived along the Grand Concourse, there were other faces of the Bronx. And one of the important strands for me in the book was what it was like to be not white, not Jewish, not American ethnic. And one of the most fascinating stories had to do with what was called the Bronx slave market. It wasn't slaves, but it had been christened that by an investigative reporter in the mid-30s who wrote about the phenomenon of women who would come up to the Bronx, hang out on street corners, and wait for day work cleaning houses. Next picture. This is a Washington photographer who took many stirring pictures of black life, took these pictures. They were paid very little, they were often cheated, and sometimes when I've shown these pictures talking to groups, people have said, well, we weren't racist and we didn't underpay our maids and we treated everyone well. And it's a history that it is obviously very hard to pin down because the vast majority of people who were part of this world are no longer alive, because it tended to evaporate by the 50s after the war, when there was more regulation of domestic work and the economy picked up. So these are Depression era images. But one of the reasons I think it's important to think about the variety of population in the Bronx, even in the early years, is because of what became of the Bronx in the later years. Next image. This is the Lorelei Fountain in 1977 after the blackout, where there were hordes of people running up and down the boulevard and looting stores on the side streets. And it was one of the seminal horrible moments of the boulevard, and you can see the graffiti on the statue, which I'm happy to say was restored in time for its 100th anniversary, and now, although there were threats to remove it to what was described as a neighborhood where people would take better care of it, was sort of racial slur in there, nonetheless was able to stay in the Bronx and is in Joyce Kilmer Park near the courthouse and is lovely, and people take very good care of it. But it's an image that helps you remember what horrible things happened to this part of the Bronx in the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, and it's a very familiar litany. The drugs, the crime, the population unrest, the fires, the arson, the failing schools, the failing hospitals, the fear, nothing worked. And the reasons for that are very familiar. Next image. Some people say the fault was Co-op City, shows everyone at a more optimistic moment, the groundbreaking. Some people say the culprit was the Cross Bronx Expressway. That's what Robert Caro says. The sort of new wave of Moses historians say no, but both the Cross Bronx and Co-op City, whatever their real role in the tumultuousness of the Bronx that occurred in the last part of the 20th century, they were important symbols because the Co-op City represented the complex of buildings to which so many people from the West Bronx fled and were replaced by a different population that was a minority population, but more to the point, it was a poor population. And it was a population that wasn't necessarily there by desire, unlike the early settlers. And the Cross Bronx, while neighborhoods that didn't have a highway plowed through them suffered significantly in Brooklyn, of course, but it became such an important symbol of what ramming a multi-lane highway through residential neighborhoods could do. And people also blamed the New York Times because they said that articles about a racial change in the Bronx were sort of creating racial chains and driving people out. So the New York Times was seen as one of the culprits, and interestingly, I went to meetings or events where this was discussed, and people 50, 60 years later could quote verbatim passages from articles in the Times that they thought had helped lead to the downfall of the Bronx. Then I'll stop. One reason I was very lucky to be able to write the book when I did. I tried to write this book 30 years ago, and no one in the world wanted a book about the Bronx. I swear, I was the only person who wanted to write a book about the Bronx or read a book about the Bronx. But one reason I was very lucky to do the book when I did is I was able to write about an upswing. And I don't personally think it's as much of an upswing as a lot of people do. There's a lot of sort of ballyhoo about Sobro, the South Bronx, and the artists, and so on. It's still the poorest urban county in America. I think a third the population below the poverty line, which is very low. The schools are mostly awful. There's still crime. There's still bad housing. But as with the city at large, and certainly before the recession, it's in far better state than it was during its harder years. People are moving there, whites, blacks, Asians. People are moving into the Art Deco buildings. It's considerably safer. There are people who don't remember the label of the South Bronx and what it means. I think young families are less likely to move because the schools are still very trouble, but young couples and single people, the buildings are still sturdy and beautiful and convenient. And people who move here now speak about the area with the same glowing tones as the Jews who were there 3/4 of a century ago. And And I think people involved in the borough's fortunes think that that's a very hopeful sign and hope that it continues. Thank you.
We'll turn the lights up a little bit.
Yeah. And good questions? I have to say, every time I talk about the book, I feel that my sieve-like memory is retaining a little less of it. And I was listening the other night to Robert Caro talking about his latest Johnson book, and I realized he just wrote it. But I think he was like able to quote the entire 500-page book. And he's older than me, and I sort of thought, oh my God, my memory is like becoming Swiss cheese. And so even before I speak, I refresh myself, but I still find I don't remember some of the details. So if I had wrong details, I hereby apologize. Any questions? Yes.
What's the current thinking about why the Bronx deteriorated? It's not the West Bronx Expressway.
The current thinking, that's a very good question. The current thinking is that it deteriorated for the reasons that so many urban neighborhoods deteriorated. I just finished reading Nick Lemon's book, The Promised Land, which I feel terrible that I didn't read before I wrote this, because I should have, and I would have been smarter had I done it. But he talks about why urban minority neighborhoods were so troubled. And the forces are not white flight. The forces are complex, and I think even today not known. They have a lot to do with government disinvestment. At the time, government money was going to the suburbs to build housing, to support to support housing, GI loans, to support highways, which were bringing people out. The job base that had been so important for earlier generations of immigrants was disappearing. It was jobs were going to the suburbs, going to the south, going overseas, or disappearing entirely due to automation. So if you didn't have a job, it was very hard to have the rest of your life work. And the indifference in both the public-private level, from insurers to the city government, the idea, planned obsolescence and benign neglect, all these terms we remember with horror. No one really wanted to do anything about these troubled areas except ignore them, and problem piled upon problem. There was no political agenda. There was no impetus to fix things. And things got worse fast, and they got worse very fast in the Bronx, which is why I think there was nothing gradual about the change in the Bronx. And I think that's why the term South Bronx became such a potent label. But I think the reasons are extremely complex, and we're still understanding them, and people are still arguing about them. Yes?
I remember growing up in Brooklyn.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
In the 60s, not far from where I was growing up, and actually it was considered good neighborhoods, and then blockbusters.
Yeah, and that happened in the Bronx.
And that was the story.
Yeah.
About in the Grand Concourse.
Yeah, and redlining, so you couldn't, get money, and welfare recipients being dumped in buildings, and if you look at the economics of housing and why it was better for landlords to have troubled, dysfunctional welfare families from an economic point of view was better, and they didn't care what was in their building. They just cared about the bottom line. And the political situation in the Bronx was just like one borough president going to jail after another. It was mind-boggling. I mean, now you think the fact that they're staying out of jail is a great achievement, but there was no political leadership of integrity that could take a hand. And I think the Bronx has always been a sort of a stepchild borough of the city anyway. I mean, people debate, will it go the way of Brooklyn in terms of cachet and housing? And I think it'll be the last to go that route. Yes?
Did you discover at the beginning who owned the land? Did the Bronx condemn just a narrow strip for the road, and the side properties that were ultimately developed maintained in private hands, or was there speculation, or once this major investment was made in terms of buying a property
I see.
and holding it and
Yeah.
developing?
You mean along the
Developing
cross
sites.
the Cross Bronx?
No, no.
Oh, in general?
The
Oh,
building sites
oh,
up and
oh.
down the
How,
concourse. If you built an
yeah.
interstate highway across the United States,
Yeah.
there's many stories of scandal of who owned
It didn't-
properties and American.
Yeah, I see what you're
government
saying.
condemnation
Yeah.
and- So how did that,
It
how was
didn't-
the land acquired?
It wasn't, I mean, to be honest, I have to say, I don't know, but it wasn't, there wasn't, other than condemnation for the route of the highway, which was a complicated and messy and politically troubled process, that in terms of the lots along the boulevard, if any of that was an issue or how it quite worked, I honestly don't know. All I know is that no one was much interested, and there was like not much speculation because no one really wanted to build up there. And really, the number of building permits that were issued in the first few years were in the single digits practically. A stable here and a little house there. So it was sort of the opposite of speculation, and that's really why nothing happened for the first decade or so.
It wasn't acquired by the Bronx and then resold
No, the river's private.
process.
No, nothing like that. Yes, sir.
Connie, it's nice to see you again, and every time
Yeah.
I come
Yeah.
to the talk
Yeah.
over the last year or so, I learn new things about my own neighborhood. And one that I
Okay.
just realized
Yeah.
now is that in the 1890s, at the beginning of the process,
Yeah.
the Bronx was not a part of New York City, of course,
No,
until 1898.
not till 1898.
Part of Westchester County, so
Yeah.
they have impact on politics there.
Yeah, yeah.
Also, the picture of from Marshall Parkway
Uh-huh.
down south, from the top of the
Yeah.
concourse down, includes the house where that little boy had the visitation
Yes, of the Virgin Mary,
after
yeah,
World
on
War
Villa
II,
Avenue.
which was an enormous
Yes.
event at the time,
Yeah.
which lasted the entire fall of 1945.
Right. And one of the great,
Thousands of people
right,
came
from all over the
from
world.
all over the
Yeah,
world,
yeah.
and I don't know, this event sort of has died actually.
Well,
Even
he's-
in local history.
Yeah, he's still alive.
Yes, he's still
He's,
there.
yeah,
still
he's
the same house.
not young, but when I was at the city section, we did a story about him, and he was like there and sort of hanging on, and it was that was a fascinating. I mean, there was a lot of Lindbergh history threaded through the Bronx. There, famous people have come and gone, but his story, although his name was not famous, but the idea that there was a young child who saw an image of the Virgin Mary and that she came back night after night, and crowds came from around the world, and the media circus is hard to describe, and of course the idea of going back to your life in your troubled tenement with your father who beat you when there was no money, and continuing your life is the stuff of high drama. But when you think of media events today, that was about as big as they came. Yes.
Is there a relationship between the major development along the concourse and the building of this big independent, number of D train?
Well, the D train was built in 1933, at which point they had to rip out all the trees and move them, I think, Pelham Park. But it was considered a good thing for the concourse because there's yet another, quick, easy, efficient route of transportation. It was very disruptive, and my sense is that people are, we just finished, we just got it planted, and here you are ripping it up again. But in the long run, it was a very good thing to have happened to the Grand Concourse. Well, the development was already spurred. I mean, because it really started in the very late 20s and was continuing with a vengeance through the 30s. All these buildings were going up then into the early 40s when Art Deco seemed to be hanging on by its fingertips. And then the last new private construction residential building on the Grand Concourse, Executive Towers, many of you know, just north of the courthouse. And that opened in the early 60s. It looked like, speaking of skyscrapers, I guess it was a skyscraper, looked like the white brick apartment houses you see on the Upper East Side. And that was really built as an effort, people said, to save the Grand Concourse. And obviously by the time it opened, it was too late. And the area was already on a downswing by the time it opened. But that too is now on an upswing, and it has great apartments that are not expensive and that are very sturdy and that people are very happy to live in. Yes? Yes.
Actually, I'm going to ask you two things.
Okay.
On the comment. This takes
I don't know if there's a, do you see a date there?
No, I'm just guessing on the fact that
Yeah.
based on the clothing that Rockefeller.
No, yeah, yeah.
I think it's, no, it can't be late.
It's late
That's-
60s. Herman
that's-
Gio wasn't broke.
What? That's the
You know, this is the groundbreaking. The date's in my book. I can check the date. But it's right, you know, before it. You know, I thought it was late 60s, but you know, this is one of the facts that is in the book. Yeah. 1966. Okay, that makes sense, yeah. And it opened in, you know, over several years because it was so big.
I remember this very clearly.
Yeah,
I was in high school.
yeah. And the second,
So my question to you is in terms of people saying that it was in Co-op City, but
Yeah.
this in terms of the decline, isn't it really all of it together? And I mean, Co-op City was kind of an example of what was happening with people who were leaving the Bronx for a lot of reasons. They thought it was to move up.
yeah.
If you went to Westchester or you went to Long Island or whatever, and what ended up being was there was housing stock that was abandoned and it ended up being
Yeah.
cheap.
But with,
That's how all the public systems.
yeah, but of course, as people rightly pointed out, similar devastation occurred in Brownsville and East New York and Bed-Stuy, where they didn't have a co-op city, and many people from the Bronx went to Westchester. The synagogues followed them up there. They went to New Jersey. Co-op city didn't help. But one reason it didn't, I mean, the forces that created change in the Bronx were very deep and profound and tangled and complicated. But what I think was significant about Co-op City, as well as the Cross Bronx, is they were very, very powerful symbols. You're welcome. Yes.
I guess one more question about, they had a discussion on Atlanta Roosevelt last week on why they thought the reason that the Bronx would be the last.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, just redress that, since you've done so much studying, why do you think the Bronx would be treated like this?
I think that, although I think people would not have predicted 40 years ago that Brooklyn would have the cachet that it has now. I mean, that still sort of amazes me. But I think that the Bronx, because it did become such a symbol of urban poverty, you know, South Bronx, the Bronx is burning, Carter, Cosell, you name it, that it's very, you know, it's like Watts. You know, it's going to be hard for Watts to not mean urban riot, or Pruitt-Igoe. You know, these certain, you know, buildings that have become so linked with their troubled fortunes. And I think that because it was so bad in the Bronx and it was so sudden, and because the labels got attached, you don't have to know anything about baseball to know what Cosell said, that it's going to be the last parts of New York to shake off this stigma. I think that the housing stock of Brooklyn, the brownstones, the low-rise neighborhood, the very elegant buildings, the Bronx has some, but not, it's very, the texture of the neighborhoods is very, very different. I mean, even, you know, Bed-Stuy had gorgeous buildings. They were just big burned, but they were lovely. And other neighborhoods that have suffered. So I think that part of it is public perception. I think part of it has to do with housing. I think a lot of it has to do with the poverty level, that it's worse in the Bronx than in Brooklyn or Queens or Staten Island. And it seems very endemic poverty. And I think that sometimes things sort of build on themselves. I mean, there becomes a wave and things get better even if there are no real explanations. But I think it's very complicated, and I think whatever happens in the Bronx is going to take a long time. Yes?
Your first picture of the concourse shows 3 green belts, and eventually it ended up in one narrow green belt down the center. Why didn't they ever think of making it a wide green belt similar to Broadway, and therefore much more pedestrian?
Well, they wanted to make it do a lot of things. And what also complicated the Grand Concourse is it was built before the auto, but when it opened, there were cars. So it had to get retrofitted very quickly. But it was going to be, I mean, part of the impetus for the building of it was to give riders, the Horse and Rider Club, I think they were called, a route on which to race their fast horses uptown, up to the parks, the great Bronx parks. So there was the middle lane for these horses, and then there were on either side the carriages with the horses, And then on either side of that, there are the pedestrian walkways with the mothers and the nurses and the baby carriages and the strollers. And so this is what you had. So the lanes increasingly got reconfigured as needs changed, and the automobile, of course, was the major reason. And then as in the 60s and 70s, there was a very odd and inexplicable, again, reconfiguring of the lanes so it could be an urban thoroughfare, and this is why there were so many fast car deaths. It became, one of the boulevards of death, like Queens Boulevard, but it became an increasingly, a thoroughfare that took you from south to north and not safe. Yes?
How long would it, I haven't been up there, how long would it take to get from the Grand Concourse to the center of Midtown?
That's right, it's 15 minutes from the Concourse Plaza Hotel, which 161st Street, and the Concourse, then the subway down the hill to Midtown. It's about 15 minutes, and it is about 30 minutes to Wall Street. It's incredibly fast.
This is a good opportunity
Okay.
to...
Thank you very much.